Good afternoon and good morning to folks on the West Coast, and welcome to the Center for Migration Studies webinar entitled Preparing for the Trump Administration's Immigration Policies. I'm Mario Russell, Executive Director of the Center for Migration Studies, CMS, a research and education institute whose work is focused on and generated by the migrant experience and that of receiving communities, with the objective of promoting policies that are both fact and evidence-based and that safeguard the dignity of the person. I'm delighted to see such a good number of you on this webinar. We're gathering today with a palpable sense of apprehension and concern and anxiety about what is to come for migrants, for immigrants and refugees in America. For many of us, if not most, in fact, this is perhaps a familiar feeling, a revisited feeling from 8 years ago. And I would say that in many ways, things have not really changed from that time. It's the same rhetoric, the same vitriol, and to some extent, the easy and cheap scapegoating of 8 or more years ago. We did hear pretty much what we needed to hear during the long presidential campaign, which included a comment just about a year ago: when I'm president, on day one, instead of fighting Texas, I will work hand in hand with Governor Abbott and the other border states to stop the invasion, seal the border, and rapidly begin the largest domestic operation in history. Those that Biden has let in should not get comfortable because they will be going home. We have seen also the content of the mandate for leadership, the conservative promise, as it's called, known as Project 2025, whose strategy outlines how an administration should and could probably degrade and diminish the regulatory, the legal, the administrative, funding, and constitutional immigration policy landscape. It is and holds within it essentially a long catalog of campaign promises. The questions that we'll be touching on today go to what might be realistic and probable efforts under the incoming administration, whether going to mass deportation, border closure, slashing of the refugee resettlement program, birthright citizenship, and much more. Most, if not all, of these policy and law targets are founded on factual error, misinformation, if not outright disinformation, which is set to bend to a degree the American imagination and will against its own strengths, its own history and identity with respect to migration, which is the greatest generator of culture, economy, stability, and vitality. Let me just say a few words in that regard with respect to mass deportation. 4 things. 1, mass deportation is family separation, full stop. U.S. citizen children will be the ultimate victims of this plan. And in October 2024 report, CMS estimates that 4.7 million U.S. households will experience separation, with 5.5 million U.S. citizen children experiencing their own trauma of separation from one or both parents. Second, 7.6 million of the undocumented are members of the U.S. workforce, staffing essential occupations in important areas such as agriculture, construction, healthcare, and more. And therefore, it goes important to mention that 25%, a quarter of the yearly income that's brought in by this workforce of about $375 billion would be lost. That is about $97 billion. Third, with respect to the legality and cost of this plan, whether it invokes the Posse Comitatus Act, the Insurrection Act, or the Aliens Enemies Act to deploy armed forces, this administration's talk has generated alarm. And whether any of those strategies are viable is an open question, perhaps doubtful. But the plan ultimately is absurd and counterproductive on its face. By our estimate, a deportation plan of that size and scope would cost probably upwards of $1 trillion. And to ask the question, to what end? And finally, over half that is 54% of the population that is undocumented, have lived in the United States for over 10 years, working, serving, and building their lives. And I should note that a significant proportion of that are DACA, TPS, and other liminal status holders. So ultimately, this is a question that must go beyond rule of law, rigid application of law. Law must serve humankind, not the opposite. We can do better, and we are better. In the words of the ethicist Joseph Cairns, quote, immigrants become members of society over time, and their social membership gives them a moral claim to most of the legal rights that citizens enjoy. That is, living in a place makes you one part of that place. So we have three important and distinguished guests, speakers, and experts today. They will be speaking to you in turn, and at the end of that, we will open it up to questions for discussion, which you should put in the Q&A box, and I will moderate those questions, read them to the group. We're delighted first to welcome Theresa Brown, Senior Advisor for Immigration and Border Policy at the Bipartisan Policy Center, a leading, consistent, and balanced voice in the immigration space for many years. Theresa previously served in various policy advisor and advocacy capacities at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, the American Immigration Lawyers Association, at the U.S. Customs and Border Protection. And today, Theresa will speak to the present and challenging political dynamics and what legislation might be possible in the near term. She'll give us a little bit of a close-up look at what are the positions held by various parties on the issues of the moment. Next, we welcome Charles Wheeler, Director Emeritus and Senior Attorney of Training and Technical Assistance at the Catholic Legal Immigration, Inc., known as Clinic. Charles is one of the leading authorities in the immigration law and practice area. He has served for over 40 years in the field, training, educating, and developing generations of lawyers and practitioners through Clinic. Charles has written and trained extensively in all areas of immigration law, including family reunification, public charge, asylum, immigrants' rights, naturalization, and more. Charles recently co-authored an important article titled 10 Likely Changes to Immigration Policy Under Trump 2.0. Go read it if you haven't read it. It's on the CMS website. It's significant, important, and synthetic. It brings together really what we can envision and potentially imagine in the next 4 years. We're also thrilled, absolutely, to have with us today Eréndira Rendón, Vice President for Immigrant Justice at the Resurrection Project in Chicago, which is one of the most dynamic and innovative on-the-ground services projects for immigrants today, where a team of multidisciplinary practitioners work to build and strengthen vulnerable families with a holistic approach that is founded on equal parts support and empowerment. And under her leadership, the innovative immigration work now includes advocacy, direct representation, leadership development, and a recently launched development and formation opportunity called the Colibri Fellowship. Eréndira has been in the immigration field for many years, bringing personal and professional experience to bear, and bringing a particular passion and determination, which was noted by the governor of Illinois, who described her as making a profound impact on Illinois' families and communities. So we look forward to hearing from the three of you. I will turn off my speaker, and Theresa, I will turn it to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mario, and thank you to the Center for Immigration Studies for inviting me today. You know, most of us that are been in and working around immigrants for quite some time are, you know, sometimes looking with trepidation, but all of us are sort of, I think, in a sense of expectation. President Trump will be inaugurated next Monday, but the new Congress has already started its work. And we are seeing lots of impacts of the election on Congress and the issues it is taking up with regard to immigration, how it is trying to legislate. Republicans do have majorities in the House and the Senate, although they are quite narrow. In particular, because President Trump has nominated several House Republican members to cabinet positions, the number of seats that the Republican majority have is down to about one vote, which means that Republicans are going to have to manage to try to keep everyone in their party on side on every vote they do. And that is already proving challenging for Speaker Mike Johnson in the House. In the Senate, Republicans have 3-seat majority. But we all know that the Senate also has this issue of the so-called filibuster, which means that in order to actually get to voting on legislation, it takes 60 members to agree to move to considering legislation, which does give the minority in the Senate a little more power in terms of what can move in the Senate and what can get enacted. However, there are ways that the majority can control the floor, can control the timing, and by getting a few members of the other party on board, still move their agenda. So that's sort of the mechanics of who's in charge and how things work in the House and the Senate. But when it comes to immigration legislation, I think what we are seeing from both Speaker Mike Johnson in the House and the new Republican majority leader in the Senate, John Thune, is a desire to try to move the agenda that President Trump ran on and is trying to come in with. So we've already seen a few bills on immigration put on the House floor, one of which the Lake and Riley Act did pass, and it is being considered in the Senate right now. Interesting, one of the dynamics and an outcome, I think, of the election is that more Democrats seem to be amenable to working with Republicans on some of this legislation. The Lake and Riley Act actually picked up some additional Democratic votes this time when it passed the House from when it passed last time. Many of these are moderate members. They may be in districts that President Trump won. And they are looking to see how they can show that on immigration, they are not, whatever term you want to say, but soft, or are willing to at least appear to be recognizing the concerns that their constituents are saying they have about immigrants and immigration coming to the United States. So the Lake and Riley Act, for those who aren't aware, named after the Georgia nursing student who was tragically killed by an undocumented immigrant last year, would require mandatory detention of any individuals who have been accused of or charged with certain crimes, including theft or burglary, things that are not required to be mandatorily detained right now. There's another section of the bill that also is not directly related to detention of immigrants, but related to broader immigration policy, which would allow state attorneys general to sue the federal government when they believe an immigrant has been released in custody that should not have been and has caused some sort of damage to someone in the state. It would also require that they can sue in federal court to mandate that the federal government enforce laws differently on those arriving to the border, and impose visa sanctions on countries that are not taking back their deportees. So these are broad-based immigration policy authorities that the government has that it would give states via the federal judiciary the ability to essentially mandate the federal government carry out certain enforcement actions. So this has the potential, I think, Mario, to what your points were, to be a very large area of litigation. It's not like we haven't seen a lot of litigation over federal immigration policy over the last decade, but this would likely increase it. I'm not an attorney, so I'm not going to speak to whether or not this would be constitutional or anything else, but almost certainly if it were to be enacted, we would see an even larger increase in litigation that the federal government might be subject to under this or any future administration. The bill is being considered in the Senate, and interestingly, many Senate Democrats voted to proceed to debate the bill. this is the Senate has several steps before you get to final passage of a bill. Several votes have to be taken to allow consideration of a bill, consideration of amendments, closing of debate, and closing of amendments. And many Democrats, interestingly, voted to allow the bill to be considered on the floor, giving this more than 60 votes needed. Many Democrats have offered amendments, some of which are being considered now. The first amendment, I believe Senator Coons had put forward, which would delete that provision of the bill on litigation, was not passed, but Senator Cornyn had a bill that had an amendment that would expand the crimes for which someone had to be mandatorily detained, and that did pass with bipartisan votes. So all of which is to say, I'm not saying anything in particular about the Lake and Riley Act, but it's the first immigration-related bill that we're seeing move through the new Congress. And it's instructive for its understanding of where Republicans and Democrats are on these issues right now. We are seeing a shift from sort of a wall of opposition by many Democrats to one trying to feel out where they might be able to cooperate with Republicans and with President Trump on immigration issues, opening up new avenues for potential bipartisanship on other bills that may come forward. The other things that Congress does have to do every year is pass an appropriations. At the end of last year, Congress punted this year's annual appropriations to March with a continuing resolution that will expire on March 20th. So that's sort of the next place under which different types of amendments, funding provisions might be added to pay for some of the things President Trump promised to do, such as his mass deportation efforts. Republicans are also considering using a congressional authority called budget reconciliation to try to enact certain legislation without with a bare majority of votes in the House and the Senate, which would mean they would not necessarily need to negotiate or work with Democrats to get anything passed. Certain things can and can't be considered on reconciliation. Democrats found this out when they tried to use reconciliation for immigration efforts at the beginning of the Biden administration. In general, things that relate to budgetary items such as spending or revenues or debt or deficit can be included on budget reconciliation. So we would imagine that that process would include money for additional deportation resources, whether it's airplanes or agents or facilities to detain people, additional monies for border enforcement, border wall. All of that is certainly within the scope of what budget reconciliation could be considered. However, broad policy changes, such as who can be considered for asylum at the border, would likely not be able to be included on such a bill. And at least right now, Republican leadership in the Senate, where these rules are mostly enforced, have said they don't intend to sort of look at those kind of things on reconciliation. But that doesn't mean they won't be considered in other places. So I'm focusing a lot on Congress here. At the end of the day, Congress does have to pay for whatever it is that President Trump wants to do, even if he tries to use other things like an emergency declaration to be able to move monies around the executive branch. Eventually, Congress has to fund what it is he wants to do. And so Congress will have a say in immigration policies. But I just point out that already from the get-go, we are seeing immigration legislation as a priority for this 119th Congress. Now, how much President Trump will rely on Congress to do other things is to be determined, I think. In general, he much prefers to do things that he can or believes he can by executive action because he finds, I think, the legislative process cumbersome, difficult, and frustrating, which frankly, I do too. But if he wants to get things done, he prefers to see what he can do without having to engage in that process. But that doesn't mean Republicans don't want to try to help him as much as possible. I think the other thing they're doing as quickly as possible is trying to confirm his nominees. We've seen many hearings this week for many of his nominees, and the Secretary of Homeland Security nominee, Kristi Noem, will be up for her Senate hearing tomorrow. So we'll get a chance to hear from her how she intends to work with the Trump administration and the promises that he has made in immigration. So I will leave it at that and let my other panelists address the other issues that we want to talk about today.
Thanks, Theresa. A lot of attention, justifiably, has been put on enforcement and what we can expect under Trump. He's promising to deport as many as 12 million people. His henchman, Stephen Miller, has promised that on day one, as soon as Trump puts his hand on the Bible, we can expect a overwhelming blitzkrieg of enforcement actions, flurry of executive orders. All of that, of course, is going to be probably true, and we're preparing for that in various ways. I wanted to talk about a subject that doesn't get as much attention, and that is the issue of legal immigration, which is really at the heart of what Trump wants to do, which is reduce immigration, stall it, eliminate it in some places, and really affect the number of people who are eligible to advance, become permanent residents, or even enter the United States. And that's really his ultimate goal, as well as the people in his cabinet. So let me talk a little bit about what we can expect on that front, and I'll run through a laundry list of things that I worry about. During the first Trump administration, they spent, and I would also say wasted, about 3.5 years approaching this ground of inadmissibility called public charge. And they passed 2 regulations, one dealing with the Department of Homeland Security, the other Department of State, trying to redefine public charge in a very onerous way to attempt to make it much more difficult for particularly low-income people to become permanent residents. That was ultimately unsuccessful because of the lawsuits that were filed to enjoin it. What Trump tried to do is add new public benefits to the programs that if people had obtained, it could affect them, as well as the likelihood of obtaining any of these public benefits. But they did something clever, which is they looked at the statute, which had been in existence for decades, which identified certain factors that the Immigration Service has to look at from the intending immigrant. What in fact had happened over the course of those decades was that the Immigration Service looked at the affidavit of support, the sponsor's declaration. That's the U.S. citizen or permanent resident filing on behalf of a family member. And they really ignored all the factors that the intending immigrant had. So even though Biden came in and erased all those regulation changes, issued a new regulation, and redefined how that should be interpreted, Trump could simply come in and change the policy manual, which is, of course, the rule of law for the adjudicators, and redefine those standards in such a way that they could make it much more difficult for people based on their age, their health, their employment skills, their education, their ability to speak English, all sorts of factors, their ability to obtain and have health insurance. That could make it much more difficult and much more demanding. So I'm worried about that. Other things on my checklist, travel bans, of course, that was notorious. After 2 failed attempts, they at last were able to get a travel ban against mostly Muslim countries. 8 countries were barred from sending anybody to the United States during most of Trump's administration. Those were people from Iran, Libya, Somalia, Syria, Yemen, Venezuela, North Korea, and Chad. They eventually dropped Iraq and Sudan based on Supreme Court decisions. But anyway, I can expect that to be renewed in addition to others who might be added to that, Nicaragua, maybe some other countries in South America that are not as favorable to the administration. Another one, probably even bigger, is something called the use of Title 42, which is a relatively obscure public health statute that allows the president to stop and close the border for immigration in a public health emergency. And we certainly had one with the pandemic, but since that is now passed as an emergency and a threat, the Trump administration is certainly going to be looking for other reasons and bases for that. It's kind of a goal without a purpose, well, without a legitimate cause, I guess you would say, rebel without a cause. And I think they're going to be coming up with rather spurious excuses for doing that. But that's certainly their goal, is to seal the border for all legal immigration based on that. Refugee numbers. The president has the ability to determine how many refugees enter the United States. During the first Trump administration, that was lowered to almost nothing. So we can expect that same effect, as well as the effect on nonprofit agencies serving those refugees, who had to start basically all over again during the Biden administration, hiring up and getting geared up. Other programs related to that, the Central American Migrant Minors Program, which allows minors living in various countries where their parents have applied for asylum to be able to enter. Various parole programs for specific countries. For example, Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, Venezuela, that's going to come to an end, as well as something called family reunification, which allows people waiting in line for their visa to become available to enter the United States and wait here in the United States. That's going to come to a crashing halt. I'm worried about a lot of provisions related to family-based immigration, which is really my specialty. They can change the standard, for example, on waivers, hardship waivers, that where people now have to file a waiver before they leave the United States and get that approved based on something called unlawful presence bar. Right now, the pass rate is about 85%, but if they were to tighten up on the definition and policy related to how extreme hardship is defined, that could severely impact that group of people. Adjustment of status, where you obtain your permanent residency here in the United States, is technically discretionary, but the USCIS doesn't really pay much attention to that. They could focus on that during the next Trump administration, make people prove their worthiness to get permanent residency in various ways. Anyone who files for adjustment of status now and who's denied for various reasons basically just sort of disappears into the atmosphere as far as enforcement. But they could now require that everyone who is denied is now issued what's called a notice to appear, implementing and starting enforcement procedures. And that would send a severe chilling effect on people who would otherwise simply hold off in filing to get their permanent residency for fear that may be denied and put in proceedings. Something called requests for evidence and notices of intent to deny would accelerate in such a way that a lot of useless and unnecessary requests for additional evidence would be issued, trying to slow the whole process down. Mandatory interviews for people applying for adjustment or removing conditions on their permanent residency, applying for work authorization, various other applications and benefits. If you require mandatory interviews, that basically almost puts a halt on the progress of any application and petition. So I'm sure they're planning to be using that religiously, so to speak. Staff reductions. We can see Immigration Service shifting enforcement and adjudication ability, so that a lot of people with pending applications are going to grow in the backlog that currently exists. Closing offices overseas, Department of State refusing to fill vacancies, slowing down that process as well. Shifting priorities in general, letting backlogs continue to grow in areas where people would otherwise be able to continue. And that would be with adjustment of status, petitions starting the process, work permits that now are allowed to be extended for a certain period of time, knowing that the backlogs would otherwise affect them. That could be cut short or eliminated. And then finally, fee increases that we all worry about in terms of its impact on low-income people. And then finally, naturalization. And you would assume that naturalization would be something that the Trump administration would be encouraging, given the fact that certainly most recently, a lot of naturalized citizens are now voting in the Republican way. Nevertheless, it's a benefit that goes to immigrants, and that by definition is something the Trump administration wants to decrease or eliminate. So we're going to see a return of what's called extreme vetting of anybody applying for naturalization. They're going to be scouring their record, their social media, anything that might indicate that they should not have been granted permanent residency. And if they find some minor flaw, they could issue, again, notice to appear, starting rescission proceedings. So that's going to discourage a lot of people as well. And then finally, a tougher civics and literacy test that they tried to implement at the end of the Trump administration, first one. So we're going to see a return on that. All right, that's the good news. And let me now pass it on to Eréndira to talk a little bit more about all the parade of horrors we can expect.
I'm just gonna keep going on with the good news, Charles. Thank you. Buenas tardes. My name is Eréndira, but I go by Ere Rendón. I am Vice President of Immigrant Justice at the Resurrection Project in Chicago. First, want to thank Mario and CMS for putting on this webinar together and for all of the work you do to keep us informed out in the field as well. So I myself am a documented immigrant. I came to the US when I was 4 years old to be reunited with my dad. I grew up in a small town on the border of Illinois and Wisconsin. Thankfully, most of the time on the Illinois side, although I have quite a bit of family that lives on the Wisconsin side. And I say that because it is so important that as we see either very little happening or really bad things happening at the federal level. So many of us have spent so much time on figuring out how to make things a little bit better for immigrants in our states. It's not a perfect solution, and it's obviously not a solution for everybody, but it has helped protect as many folks as possible and have a better quality of life for folks in Illinois. My dad was actually deported when I was a little girl. I barely remember it, but that led to us becoming homeless. It led to us having to figure out where to live. It led to us moving to Wisconsin for a couple of years, and continues to affect us in our inability for my dad to ever be able to adjust his status. My entire family remains undocumented. My middle brother and I have DACA, and my oldest brother and my parents don't have any protection. So I have been working at the Resurrection Project now for 15 years, was able to start our Immigrant Justice Department and have been able to grow it to what it is now. I'm going to talk a little bit about what we're doing to get prepared to fight off as many deportations as possible in Chicago and in Illinois. But I think it's important to say that we haven't just started preparing. We started preparing when Trump was first elected into office. So back in November of 2016, none of our government agencies and none of our local government levels were funding immigration legal services for the undocumented community. We immediately, the day that Trump was elected, immediately started advocating to then Mayor Rahm Emanuel to establish a legal protection fund. And it became the first legal protection fund that was announced post Trump. First win, and it started off at $1 million. It's not big enough. Chicago should really be doing a much better job than what it's been doing, but right now we are at $3 million every year for the city of Chicago. In 2019, we decided to launch a campaign to get the state to also do something similar. And we started with a $10 million win in which the state appropriated $10 million for the Illinois Access to Justice program. Half of that funding goes to immigration legal services administered by us at the Resurrection Project, and half of that funding goes to our partners at the Westside Justice Center to administer legal services for other civil needs, both of us of subgrant to various organizations across the state. In Illinois Access to Justice is now $25 million that is appropriated year after year. In the county, in Chicago, the way that our public defender model works is that it's actually our county who houses our public defenders, Cook County. And in 2020, we launched a campaign to be able to establish an immigration unit inside of the public defenders. And that we were able to be successful in 2020 and in 2021 passed legislation at the state level to be able to give jurisdiction to the public defenders. And so in 2016, we didn't have any legal services funding for undocumented immigrants in our city, in our state, and our county. And it was really impacting our ability to be able to provide funding at scale. To now, we have at the city level, the Chicago Legal Protection Fund. At the county level, we have an immigration unit. And then at the state level, we have two sources of funding. The Illinois Access to Justice Program, which is sort of the larger and more established funding. And now because of the recent, because of the wave of new arrivals and the legal services that we had to stand up for recent arrivals in the last 2 years, have been able to establish the ILSP, the Immigrant Legal Support Program. So total now we have about $30 million that is being appropriated specifically for immigration legal services, pretty specifically for the either undocumented community or community that does not have legal permanent residency. There is a separate pool of funding for naturalization called the New Americans Initiative that is administered by our partners, the Illinois Coalition for Immigrant and Refugee Rights. So what this has allowed us to do is to be able to establish a network of organizations that work collectively and work together to be able to provide legal services to the undocumented community. In the first 4 years of the administration, of the Trump administration, with a strong focus on deportation defense, a strong focus on making sure that as many folks as possible were able to adjust their status, were able to apply for things like U visas, T visas, and as you all know, in the first 4 years, to some of the stuff that Charles said, those things were really taking a lot longer than was necessary, and there was a lot more bureaucratic kind of changes that were happening to stall our progress there. What is also unique about some of our models is that we don't, we do provide legal services, but we also provide funding for community navigators. So community-based organizations who may not have a legal clinic have, are able to tap into the source of funding, which one allows us to create an army of folks who are primarily immigrants who are going out into the community and giving those Know Your Rights presentations, who are going to be trained in the future if we see policy changes like rescinding TPS, like rescinding DACA. We need to make sure we now have 700 community navigators throughout the state who we develop curriculum, we do train the trainers, and then they go out into the community and reach hundreds of thousands of immigrants. For our deportations, the work that we will be doing to stop deportations includes community navigators, but it also includes a strong partnership with various organizations. So in Illinois, there is one hotline to report an ICE raid or to report an ICE arrest, which is a family support hotline run by ICIRR. And there's one form that you can online form that you can fill out to report an ICE arrest or an ICE raid, which is run by us at trpimmigrantjustice.org. From that, it'll trigger a alert to both organizations who we each have networks who will go out and either verify that this is really happening or who could, depending on the location, tap into rapid response networks. That will actually, if we verify that there is a raid, say there's a workplace raid, it'll allow us to open up our workshops. We do have workshops 4 times a week in the city of Chicago, twice, and then about 3 times a week throughout the rest of Illinois, which had been primarily set up and continue to operate as TPS EAD and asylum workshops. Those will become rapid response legal workshops, meaning we will be able to do comprehensive screenings for folks who are affected by raids, either their family members, if the individual is detained, or folks that maybe were detained given their next steps for their deportation cases and then release. So we are able to see about 70 people a day. And so we have the capacity to be able to do at a larger scale intake and sitting down with an attorney or DOJ accredited rep to be able to see what your options are for your deportation case. If you are detained and not released, we do have a collaborative called the Midwest Immigrant Defense Alliance, which what will happen is when you go to court, you will be asked if you have an attorney. If you do not have an attorney, you will be asked if you want to speak to one. We only reach about 50% of the demand right now. But if you say, no, I do not have an attorney and I do want to speak to one, you will be placed with one of our intake specialists from one of our organizations. That intake specialist will conduct a legal screening, and then one of the organizations from the network will take on these cases. And it is universal representation model, meaning it is merit blind. So we are looking right now actively to try to expand that network, and so that we can reach a higher amount of the demand. So what is great about the work that we've been doing in the last 8 years is that we have been focused on being able to expand our capacity to take on cases. Whether that be in the last 4 years to have where we've done so much, so much affirmative work, or what we anticipate now to be more defensive and much more labor intensive. But we have set up our structures, we have set up our legal services funding, we have set up our models to be able to be responsive to the needs, depending on where the wind's blowing at the federal level. So I encourage you to go to trpimmigrantjustice.org to check out some of our resources. You can download Know Your Rights material. If you're local to Illinois, you can request a Know Your Rights training for your church, school, community center. Also then that is actually the place where folks will be able to both report ICE raids as well as sign up for our legal services. So thank you.
Thank you, Ere. Thank you so much for these kind of comments you made, which I think actually suggest hope in a difficult moment, and also emphasize really how significant and important communication is, information is, building networks, which I think is really maybe the key at this time, and sort of best triaging the response, which maybe is informational accompaniment and consultative, or at least we'll see how that plays out over time. But I very much appreciate your bringing that forward. Charles, thank you so much for your really excellent and focused assessment of probably the many ways in which the administration will be able to slow walk, just grind down the process, whether it is staffing or notices and others that just slow things down. And Theresa, thank you so much for your kind of bird's eye view and a kind of sober assessment. But as I'd like to think, and as you said earlier in our pre-meeting, was just maybe this is a kickoff to something as good as it is potentially bad. But I wanted to start, there's a fair number of questions, and I thought I would start with two. The first one really maybe for all of you to comment on, but in particular, Charles and Ere. And then the second one, perhaps for you, Theresa. The first one, which been echoed by a couple of the folks in this webinar, relates to sanctuary generally, whether it is specific, the sanctuary idea specific to schools and places of faith, but perhaps even more broadly, sanctuary in general as it's been communicated by municipalities. And the questions are sort of general in the sense of saying, what can you say about that? What information is available about that? What should and could we know? So I would say, if you can, Charles and Ere, and I know Theresa, you were sort of potentially writing an answer on that, so feel free, of course, but could say a little bit about that. I think it's, of course, an important topic that comes up in these kinds of difficult moments. And you can start in anywhere you want. Charles, if you want to go first, that would be great.
Sure. There's been actually even written policy not to enforce in various areas, schools, churches, etc. And Trump made some cryptic remark how that would probably change during his administration. I think it's unlikely to happen. Any kind of raids in churches, schools, whatever, is going to draw tremendous backlash. I don't think he wants to invite that. For what purpose? But at the same time, he doesn't want people to let down their guard. A lot of this is to promote fear. and get people to, quote, self-deport. They feel that, oh my gosh, any day now I could be arrested. Might as well just give up and go back. So that's a lot of what they're hoping people will do. But in terms of the whole notion of sanctuary, really, it's a much broader topic in terms of out here in California, it's a sanctuary state. Other places, New York, et cetera, Chicago, they were sanctuary cities. And Trump tried to limit or reduce federal funding to the states if they were to declare themselves and refuse to cooperate with INS enforcement actions. I don't know how successful that will be. It's obviously part of their legislative effort, which is to enact laws that would basically mandate reductions in federal funding to those states. So we're going to see how that changes and how that impacts people as well. Eddie?
Yeah, I'll add a couple things. One is there's been, and there will continue to be, an effort to reverse sanctuary policies in Chicago. We did just have a positive vote yesterday to keep the current statute in place. And so I think many of us have been, have to be responsive to making sure that we try to keep those as intact as possible. To what Theresa said, right? There is now a shift in within the Democratic Party about its willingness to cooperate in certain cases, maybe with ICE. For us, what's really important is we used to have a policy in which we had carve-outs, and it made it very difficult for actually police to figure out who do they detain, who do they not detain. And in many cases, we would have to that's when we really needed a rapid response to send folks to be able to explain to police about why this person didn't fit into the carve-out. And so that'll be something, I think, an ongoing challenge that many of us will see on top of the challenge that is going to happen in the court system, where will have, the federal government try to keep some resources from places like Chicago, like Illinois, like California, and then, seeing how it will play out in the court system. There are already, in the first administration, one positive outcome, one negative outcome. And so we're going to see potentially that moving fairly quickly to the Supreme Court. The last thing I'll say is when my family has experienced deportation, we ended up moving into the house of one of my dad's coworkers. And so oftentimes sanctuary, it can be a church, it can be a safe place, but it's oftentimes our own other people's homes who are taking folks in and who are helping them in the meantime. Both for safety and for economic reasons. And so that is something that happens naturally in the immigrant community. It's not necessarily well known, or folks outside of the community may not know that actually does happen.
I just want to echo what Charles said about the sensitive locations policy, which, Tom Homan, who formerly ran enforcement and removal operations at Immigration and Customs Enforcement and was the acting director of ICE during the first Trump administration, has been named the so-called border and immigration czar in the White House. And he really does seem to be the person who's going to be point on the deportation operation of the Trump administration. And he has said, we know that there will be a lot of pushback if the public, as Charles said, starts seeing kids being arrested and sort of those kind of negative press things. So ICE, even if they decide to formally take down the sensitive locations policy, ICE agents don't necessarily like to carry out operations in those locations because of the negative publicity. I think the places that are more likely to see some effect might be sort of the areas around schools, if not going into schools. We've seen that in the past where ICE may be outside this quote unquote school zone, but may be near there. Same with hospitals. in courts. There was a lot of sort of, if you will, conflict between courts and the Trump administration last go around when ICE agents would go into court buildings. One of the reasons they would prefer to pick up people in court buildings is because they are secure locations. All of these other places are out in the public, and from an ICE perspective, they prefer to do operations in locations where there is control over, for example, firearms and exits and entries, rather than out in the open, because from their perspective, agent safety is less at risk in those places. So that may be one place that we'll see if they decide that that's a place where they can move to try to get people. But I think in general, even if they technically take down the policy, the number of operations at those locations may not be big. But, and this is a big caveat, in general, it is up to the special agent in charge of an ICE jurisdiction what operations to carry out in their jurisdiction.
Thank you, Theresa. Thank you, Charles and Edith. I'll just note that there are a lot of questions and they go from sort of the meta to the very specific. Eddie, just so you know, there are a number of questions that are asking specifically for, a little bit of your thought or input or recommendations or even links. So if you're able to take a look at those and share those with that directly yourself, that would be terrific. Several questions sort of are focusing around the question of funding. And I guess, for lack of a better term, it's either sort of retributive unfunding or is it simply defunding? One was that I saw was around, funding that might be taken away to support humanitarian efforts on the border. And then another question around funding or defunding of nonprofit groups that support and work with immigrants. Theresa, is there any chance you could field those and to the best of your ability? I realize you're not a soothsayer today.
Yeah, I'm not a soothsayer. I mean,
So
here's what I can say is that in terms of federal funding, institutions that receive federal funding, including humanitarian institutions, state and local governments, may see attempts by the Trump administration to put additional criteria on that funding relating to how you deal with immigrants or immigration. They tried this in the first Trump administration with regard to, for example, burn justice grants, which are Department of Justice grants to state and local law enforcement agencies. That was ultimately overturned in the courts, in part because the law authorizing those grants didn't allow that kind of extra criteria to be added. So it might be something that Trump would ask Congress to try to change the laws around, but I could see them going after that again. For organizations that receive state and local funding, it is up to those jurisdictions and whatever the laws or policies are in those jurisdictions for those funding. I think somebody asked a question about a national emergency declaration. I absolutely expect that President Trump will try to issue a national emergency declaration around immigration or the border, and that to try to free up funding from other parts of the federal government. I couldn't tell you what criteria he will use to make that declaration or what grounds he will do it, but I suspect that is very likely. And that would allow him in some circumstances to, for example, take money or use DOD resources for other things that it wasn't appropriated for. That was also subject to some litigation during the first Trump administration. But one of the things I think we all need to recognize is that Trump and his team have been in office before. They know what lawsuits they lost the last time around, and they are more likely to be careful in the ways that they put things forward to try to withstand litigation. Yes, there are more Trump judges on the court, and to some extent, they're relying on Trump judges in the federal courts to help them out. But at the same time, I think they understand that they made maybe some procedural mistakes that they didn't have to make in the first go around that took down some of their actions, that they won't make those mistakes again. So I think, although I fully expect a lot of litigation around a lot of what the Trump administration will do from lots of organizations, I think we have to recognize that the courts may not be the same type of backstop that they may have been in the previous Trump administration to some of these policies.
Thank you. I'm gonna take a chance and try to thread together two questions that might be a little bit disparate, but I think could potentially be connected. And I guess maybe this is for all three of you. The question of asylum is bedeviling us for a long time, really territorial asylum, obviously. And the question is, how will or how can you speculate, will the backlog, of millions of cases essentially on the docket be affected or affect the efforts of mass deportation? And it's an enormous number of the people that constitute the undocumented population, or those really in the asylum proceedings, many of whom have been sort of dumped in there in the past 24, 36 months. And so it begs the question of course, reform down the road. But can you say a word about that, and perhaps how that might relate to a question that puts forward the idea of how you anticipate if or whether military bases might be used in this kind of detention and deportation effort, which perhaps could become places where people are transferred to sort of play out the remainder of their cases in some kind of telephonic video court hearings. So just your thoughts about asylum, backlog process, mass deportation, U.S. military bases. A small subject maybe that you can do in 20 to 25 seconds, each of you.
All right.
I'm happy to talk about the military, and maybe Charles can talk about the process. I do expect that Trump will try to use military resources both for detention and for transportation. Transportation is a huge logistical issue for Immigration and Customs Enforcement. Transportation to facilities inside the United States for detention from the places that people might be arrested, and transportation to deport people outside the country. The military has been very hesitant to lend a lot of its transportation resources to ICE in the past. Trump may overrule that. But that may be something we see. And they've already talked about using both military facilities as temporary or long-term detention facilities, soft-sided facilities. It is a way to rapidly expand detention capacity that they don't have right now. I think those two are the most likely use of defense resources. I think it's highly unlikely we will see military people conducting arrests. In spite of some of the rhetoric, again, Tom Homan, whose job it has been to do that, has been tamping down some of those expectations. I think he wants to use the military in support capacities, not in direct capacities where they're interacting with migrants.
I second or echo all those thoughts, Theresa. I also think that they've been focusing their language on criminals, people who they've known have been convicted of crimes, are in federal detention already, or state detention. I'm going to target those. Those are the easy sort of low-hanging fruit. Two issues, though, that you raised, Mario. One is new applications for asylum, and I would expect a return of this thing called Remain in Mexico, which denies or bars people from entering the United States and applying for asylum. They'll be giving essentially a number, and when their number is called, they'll be able to enter, make their claim, and then leave and wait for a decision. Also, safe third-party countries like Guatemala, et cetera, that if someone passed through, they'll be sent there to wait for their asylum application to process in that country. But as far as pending applications, I would expect obviously a push for legislative change on lowering the standard, or let's say raising the standard, I guess, for asylum eligibility. I don't know how successful that'll be, but there's a lot the administration can do in terms of executive orders as well as attorney general opinions. That we saw with Jeff Sessions issuing decision, almost eliminating the issue of domestic violence and gender-based asylum claims under the notion of what is a particular social group. So I'm sure we can see a lot of those administrative decisions popping up and making it very difficult for asylum applicants to win.
The only thing I'll add is that what is going to be difficult from like providers and on the Crown end is like the managing of the amount of demand that we have had for assisting folks applying for asylum, on top of what we're going to have of the amount of demand that we're going to have for folks who are going through a deportation process. Those are both incredibly heavy, labor-intensive, resource-intensive types of cases, and I think it's going to be very taxing for folks on the ground.
Thank you. And if you'll allow another, let's say 60 seconds, we're well over time, but I really wanted to end on a positive note. And so if each of you, and Ed, I'll start with you, could just offer, a sense of hope and possibility about what is not defensive at this point and what is not potentially reactive, which is the phase we'll be in. But what is there that we can work on, in your opinion, in the next 4 years to prepare for the 4 years after that, or the 8 years after that? Something that, is forward looking, that is hope filled, that is possible. Again, not to hold you to it, but just so that we can also imagine sort of what comes at the other end and what we can work on. And then we'll wrap it up. Thank you.
I may take a couple seconds just to say that it's unusual for us to have a president that we have seen before. We kind of know, as to what Ere has said, many of the organizations have been through this before. And in spite of the elevated rhetoric, they're prepared, their plans in place. It doesn't mean it's not going to be crazy and rough and people are going to be very busy, but most of what Trump has said is not new. It's expanding on things that he tried to do in the first administration. And I think one of the things, even in spite of what I said earlier about he knows better, it's also very, very hard to do the things he wants to do. And it's always easier to promise big and a lot harder when you actually have to actually carry it out. So I think, in spite of the lots of rhetoric, the reality may be, a lot less or a lot different than what he has promised to do. And I think we need to look at that. The other thing I think is that, I mentioned the very slim majorities that Republicans have in Congress, and we're already seeing difficulties they have on their side of the aisle, on the Republican side of the aisle, and say there are that side of the aisle, in getting everybody on board to agree on what they want to do. That's going to inhibit the legislative process, even if Democrats are willing to deal with them. I think there's going to be a lot of back and forth on that. Immigration legislation, as all of us who've been in this for a long time know, is extraordinarily difficult for Congress to agree on. So I think the changes that Congress could pass, even though frankly that's where it has to happen, are going to be hard to get done. But what that means is that all of this executive action that Trump might engage in, if the laws aren't changed, the next president may do something different. That's not good for the immigration system, frankly, that every 4 years or 8 years, we have a complete 180 in what our immigration system looks like. It's not good for anything. And which is why I say Congress really does need to figure out on a bipartisan basis what we need to do there. But it's also worth recognizing that there are real limitations to what the executive branch can do at the margin, at the extremes that we're talking about.
Thank you, Theresa. So get to work with Congress. Ed, what do you think?
I think we can learn a lot from immigrants themselves who have figured it out. My parents came here without any documentation, continue to have no documentation, bought a house, put their kids through college, figuring out how to, survive, have a retirement without ever having documents in the US. And so times are tough, but immigrants are tougher.
Nice. Wonderful. Thank you, Charles.
I think we can expect overreach, so to speak, by the Trump administration, which may ultimately turn off a lot of people in the middle who voted for Trump for whatever economic reasons, but really sort of ignored his threats to deport everyone. And I think that when jobs start being lost, when companies start to hurt, when local stores start closing, when prices go up, when farmers can't get their workers, et cetera, I think people might have a second view on all this mass deportation effort. So that's one aspect. The other aspect is sort of a glimmer of hope in what Theresa is hinting, that if the Congress, in fact, could make the hard decision to, in fact, reform the immigration system, which everybody realizes is broken, this, ironically, may be an opportunity for Democrats to say, all right, you want this? Well, we want that. And nobody wants the dreamers to be deported, returned to homes that they never experienced to begin with or don't know. This is their country. It isn't where they left decades ago. And I think the American public realizes that and is not going to put up with this effort to send them back. Anyway, there's my closing thoughts.
Terrific. Well, thank you. Thank you, all three of you. This is wonderful. It sounds like we just don't give up and keep going, right? So much appreciated your time, your thoughtfulness, your insights, your wisdom. I think we should do this for an hour and a half, maybe next time. And perhaps what we'll do is do a follow-up. So to take the temperature sometime in maybe March or April. But again, with thanks and to all of those of you who participated, we had a really excellent turnout. Thank you for the good work. Much appreciated.